Howdy, friends. How are you guys doing? We were just watching the Mexican-American border, definitely. This is part 2 of the entire series of, well, the entire part 3. And we were just here on chapter, I think it's 9. And yeah, let's check it out. Obviously, all credits to the original creator of the video, who is Kraut, and you can find his channel in the description.
Of increasingly open, global and free markets growing internationally during the 1980s, the PRI jumped on board to increasingly present itself as the party of business and global markets in Mexico. The problem, though, was that the PRI was everything except that.
Yep.
It was a party built around securing the assets of a select few at the expense of excluding the masses from economic and political participation. It was the PRI which would take Mexico into that modern global era through NAFTA, a free trade agreement between the United States, Canada and Mexico. And because it was the PRI with its flaws and problems, Mexico became part of a global economy with those flaws and problems. Carlos Slim is one of the richest men in the world. He used to be the richest and is as of now still the richest man in Mexico and Latin America. How did he get there? Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates are amongst the richest men in America. They got their wealth by innovating and selling something. A means to buy products easily through an online service and a computer operating system. As disliked as the super rich may be by some, the truth of the matter and bottom line is that the United States provides a level playing field and economic structure where anyone who has an innovation with enough potential can fully exploit the potential of that innovation for their own financial benefit.
100% true.
Patent laws, anti-monopoly regulations and provide the means to build and prosper in private industry. In contrast, Carlos Slim didn't invent anything. He made his fortunes when the PRI rebranded as a free market party and started privatizing Mexico's national industries. When the PRI conducted its privatizations, it didn't put the state-owned companies up for sale to the public, but sold the shares mostly to cronies, crooks, politicians and executives close to the government, in backroom deals. Sometimes the same crooked executives who had run these sectors as public officials ended up owning them privately. In many cases, the means and ways public companies became private is dubious at best. Carlos Slim bought up a majority of shares in the Mexican telecom, but the deal he made to get those shares is curious to say the least. He didn't buy the shares with any capital. Instead, he made a weird deal in which he ended up owning the majority shares and by that extent the telecommunications networks of Mexico, while the profits made by the shares would gradually over years pay the original selling price of the shares, while the company grew in value. One can only imagine the greasy poles climbed and backroom deals made for this arrangement to have even been made possible in the first place. A transaction that in the United States would almost certainly be considered as illegal.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, this is how Carlos Slim
Definitely
ended up
illegal.
owning the Mexican telecom, which he expanded into a total monopoly over phone providers in Mexico. When the internet burst on...
Before AT&T came into Mexico, it was a full-on styled monopoly. It was a monopoly. You couldn't get any other quality phone operator, and that included cell phones. It started with the landline phones, but it applied to cell phones later. And it was until, I don't know how many, 6, 7, 8 years, I don't really know, but AT&T came as in the international company and willing to compete. And the Carlos Slim company, Mexican Phones, or Telmex, and Telcel, which is the one of the phones, got better prices and better quality for its services, but not really. That's how it was. It was a full-on monopoly. I don't know if people admire Carlos Slim in the US, for example, but here in Mexico, at least the view that I have of him is, a part of the problem. It's part of the problem, corruption.
onto the stage, he further expanded his economic power. Then he moved business into Central America and monopolized phone and internet providers there. And right now he is expanding all across Latin America, attempting to be the sole phone provider of an entire continent and cultural lingual sphere of the planet, encompassing 650 million people in 20 countries. He managed to shut down investigations into his dealings by invoking the recurso de amparo, old laws that had somehow made it into the law books of the new revolutionary Mexican Republic of the PRI and into the new Mexico of the globalized economy. Complete control over an entire sector of the economy as a monopoly, protected by law with close ties and allies in the nation's ruling elite. Almost like a sugar baron of old, only far more powerful. Carlos Slim attempted to expand his empire in the United States by similar tactics with which he built his Latin American empire.
Oof.
He violated various anti-monopoly laws in doing so, was taken to an American court where he tried to invoke a recurso de amparo, only to find no such thing existed in the United States, and was fined $300 million.
Wow.
The way one does business in the United States simply doesn't work in Mexico, and the way one does business in Mexico simply doesn't work in the United States. The way this was made possible was through the PRI. Rather than opening up the Mexican economy through the NAFTA agreement, many within the political and economic elite of Mexico saw NAFTA as an opportunity for an enormous cash-in. They opened Mexico to international business, but they didn't open the Mexican economy for ordinary Mexicans, instead dividing it up as spoils amongst themselves. The socio-economic structure of colonial Spain, which had evolved to adapt into an independent Mexican oligarchy, and then had again adapted to fit and be part of an industrialized Mexican state, and then evolved again to adapt into being part of the socialist Mexican Republic, evolved yet again to adapt into being part of a modern, globalized, neoliberal Mexico. The consequences for ordinary Mexicans were disastrous. One of the first things to happen with the opening of NAFTA was that American agriculture, which throughout the last century had modernized and mechanized into a large-scale production industrial complex, flooded Mexico with cheap produce, causing the bankruptcy of small farmers and the farming collectives and cooperatives. The now redundant Mexican farmers, in return, flooded across the border to work in whatever capacity they could throughout the United States. It may have dawned on you by now that the Mexican Nogales never even really stood a chance, that centuries of neglect and corruption led to this current state. But it is important to remind yourself that it didn't have to be like this. The opening of global markets around the world during the early 1990s created middle classes and wealth. It created industry, education, and innovation in many places throughout the world, but in particular in post-Soviet Eastern Europe. So why did it work in Europe and not in Mexico? Well, you can see why by looking at the biggest loser of the eastward expansion of the European market, Hungary. The clue being that Hungary is the most corrupt and kleptocratic of Eastern European countries. In Mexico, the existing industries were divided up amongst oligarchs rather than creating new industries. There was no innovation and no capital or security for the creation of new industry by entrepreneurs, thereby creating no new jobs. American competition ruined sectors of the Mexican economy, resulting in more unemployment. Whatever American investment came south tended to mostly sink into the pockets of the elites that had divided the Mexican economy up amongst themselves, or it just disappeared in a swamp of corruption and mismanagement, rather than create skills, expertise, and innovation from which an economy could be built. Those who gained skills and education often packed and left for the border because they saw no opportunity to live and profit from their skills and education in Mexico. In Hungary, any European investment disappeared into the pockets of kleptocratic and corrupt politicians or into their useless vanity projects like enormous stadiums. And if you are a European viewer, you probably noticed the increasing number of Hungarian doctors, nurses, scientists and engineers working throughout Europe. who came here after finding that there was no future in Hungary for them, even
Wow.
with their skills and education. During
That's
the
so sad.
1990s, the increasing productivity and inflow of capital was seen as a sign of growth and increasing wealth. But Mexico in the end just became a great
BS.
example again for how a country's GDP could grow without the country actually becoming any wealthier, as that wealth accumulated almost entirely around the singular circle of people who had no interest in creating the kind of institutions that would help the wider Mexican public accumulate capital or create capital. A small business and political elite who had monopolized capital and industry, for whom it made sense to open to America and get American money, but who stubbornly refused to open Mexico to Mexicans so they could have the opportunity to prosper, since that would turn those ordinary Mexicans into competitive.
Let me give you an idea on how hard it is to open a business in Mexico. Because, for example, I know this personally, like firsthand. It's just for me easier to like establish an LLC in Delaware and just kind of run my business as an American business that it is opening here in Mexico. You know, with an LLC in the US, you can get a US bank account, you can get an assessment from US lawyers and accountants, and it's just easier that way. That if I went to my local, I don't know, like business office, the place where you go and set up, I don't even know, because it's just so hard that I just haven't even taken that risk. And the way I make my living, that business is registered in the US. And hopefully in the future it can even be a way for me to get to the US. So that it is hard. It is incredibly hard. It's bureaucratic. And even if you get a business license or you get to open your business legally in Mexico, you know, then you have to deal with forces that, you know, like I'm even afraid to tell you, like the government, the criminal organizations, you can imagine what sort of stuff you have to deal with if you are trying to play fair by the rules, because there is no rules. There is absolutely no rules. If you have money and if you have influence, you make it. And if you don't, well, you don't. You know, you should be thankful that you're allowed to even exist as a business, not to mention grow and expand. Mexico is not a place for the little guy. Mexico is not a place, and that's why a lot of us, or at least I talk to myself, I really admire the U.S. because it's totally the opposite. You can make it in the U.S. And I'm not saying that there's not problems and corruptions, and, you know, a lot of us are not really huge fans of Jeff Bezos, right? But at the end of the day, in America, you have a lot more opportunity and a lot more freedom than you have in Mexico. In Mexico, those things are not for granted. If you have the money, then gosh, you can live like Europe, really. I have really high standards of living that I really appreciate. But if you're not like on that top 5% of the population, then you have it really, really badly.
And challenges to their power and wealth. Mexico's economic and political institutions were stuck in a previous century. In no way, shape or form was it able to compete or even just take part in a free market with the United States or Canada. Yet in a rush motivated out of a mix of idealism and greed, a group of people ignored that, signed Mexico into NAFTA, impoverished average Mexicans, and we now live with the consequences. Four years before NAFTA, the turn of the decade had been a year of enormous optimism. The decade the tyranny seemed to end. Communism collapsed into itself in Eastern Europe, and the last fascist dictatorships of Latin America fell apart. Some proclaimed that the end of history had finally arrived. In Mexico, long praised as a beacon of light and democracy for the Latin American world, a conference was held. Invited were the leading intellectuals of the world to discuss what seemed to be a bright and free and democratic future for Latin America. Mexico, a country often praised as Latin America's leader in democracy, was deliberately chosen to host for this reason. And amongst the many guests was the Peruvian novelist Vargas Llosa. who took the podium, spoke, and caused a scandal.
I hope not to appear as unpleasant in saying what I have to say. I don't believe Mexico can be separated from the tradition of Latin American dictatorships. I believe that Mexico, whose current democratization I'm amongst the first to welcome as all of us who believe in democracy, with nuances, fits firmly into this tradition as a compromising factor. Mexico is the perfect dictatorship. The perfect dictatorship is not communism. The perfect dictatorship is not the Soviet Union. It is not Fidel Castro. The perfect dictatorship is Mexico because it is the disguised dictatorship. It has one of the key factors of a dictatorship, the persistence not of a man, but of a party, and a party that is unchangeable. I do not believe that in all of Latin America there has ever been a system of dictatorship that has so efficiently recruited amongst the intellectual community and bribed them in such a subtle way. It is a sui generis dictatorship, which many throughout Latin America attempted to copy. The Mexican dictatorship is what every single Latin American dictatorship that I can remember attempted to be, the PRI.
Almost reflecting.
Wow. Very wise man, very wise words. And there's actually a movie in Mexico, and I don't know if it's translated in English, but if you know a little bit of Spanish or you can find it with subtitles, you should totally watch it. It's actually called The Perfect Dictatorship. And it's a satirical movie, it's not philosophical, it's just a satirical movie of how Mexico works. I think you should watch it. Yeah, I think a lot of you might find it entertaining, but that's not the movie. It's called The Perfect Dictatorship because of this quote. Mexico is the perfect dictatorship, like he described. And again, you watch the movie. It's interesting. It's funny.
Written words by Daniel Cosío.
It's not very good, but it's kind of
half a
fun.
century before, this today somewhat forgotten speech caused considerable controversy. Leading intellectuals such as the novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez had embraced Mexico and the PRI not as perfect, but as something that Latin America should strive to copy for a brighter and better future.
BS, man.
In the end, though, Vargas was proven completely right. The cracks in the PRI facade had started to show long before. In 1985, a massive earthquake flattened large parts of Mexico City, and the PRI government completely failed at providing relief to those in need. All the bankrupted farmers, all the unemployment, the increasing callousness with which the elites of the PRI didn't even bother hiding their corruption. At one point, it was simply enough. In 1988, the Mexican presidential elections were so obviously fraudulent that it could barely be hidden anymore. And with NAFTA, it all got worse. Everything we talked about, the dirty backroom deals, the corruption, the state repression and violence, all of it gradually came to light. And in the year 2000, in what many historians consider to be the first fair and honest elections in Mexican history, the PRI lost the presidency for the first time, ending almost 80 years of PRI rule.
Wow.
With new leaders in power, it was for the first time
80
fully
years.
exposed to the public just
80
how rotten
years.
to the core this state truly was, and the result
80
was
years.
chaos. Much of the corruption was exposed. Even worse, it was revealed to the public that the PRI had a secret deal with the drug cartels and had only pretended to fight them. With the new government no longer backing the cartel deal, the Mexican drug war flared up into the barbaric and brutal confrontation between the state and the cartels. An almost total collapse of most state institutions, in particular in regions where the PRI had deals with the cartel. The shredding of any remaining trust that the Mexican public may have once had in the institutions of the state. A collapse in economic and state cohesion. And what separates this from the United States is a border.
Chapter 10. We're not paying for your fucking wall. Jeez, this is gonna be uncomfortable.
Today there exist two completely different economic institutions in the two Nogales, and between the United States and Mexico in general, and an incredible economic disparity. This is best illustrated by looking at the famous graphs displaying distribution of wealth. These, in politics, are frequently used to show that 1% of the population supposedly owns 90% of the American wealth, but there is far more to it than simply that. There is a difference between wealth and income. When we divide the American population up into quintiles, we receive a highest quintile with 52% of the national wealth, an upper quintile with 23%, a mid quintile with 14% of the wealth, a second to bottom quintile with 8% of the wealth, and a bottom quintile with only 3% of the wealth. Of note is that the top 5% within the highest quintile, which owns 23% of the wealth. What matters the most in any wealth distribution statistic, however, are the bottom percent. Those who have an annual income of under $10,000 or under $35,000. What one should keep an eye out for, rather than just the top percent, is how much that bottom percentage of the population increases and chews away on the middle percentages. The bottom percentage is a far more important number than the top percentage. A small top percentage is a sign of inequality, but a large and growing bottom percentage is a sign of a collapsing society. Overall, the stats show that the United States is a very unequal society with a poverty problem that it ought to concern itself more with, but still a society with a middle class, however a society with decreasing upward social mobility. Nonetheless, that social mobility still exists and must be protected.
Oh yeah, totally.
Now, let's take a look at the Mexican wealth distribution.
I don't even want to watch this. I don't even want to watch this.
1% in Mexico. It's a top 0.0003%. Basically, 24 Mexican families own 90% of Mexico's wealth. Carlos Slim's empire alone accounts for almost 10% of Mexico's GDP. There's a 20% high-income class, while an enormous 42% of the population live in poverty. However, these 42% are people that the Mexican state defines as moderately poor, meaning that they can still afford basic commodities like drinking water, food, and a refrigerator. They would be considered poor by American standards, but by Mexican standards they are defined as a sort of upper poor, because 6% of the Mexican population live in extreme poverty, which is defined as a living condition under constant food insecurity, meaning can barely afford to eat on a daily basis. The Mexican-American border is a place of one of the starkest contrasts in the world. It is comparable to the borders between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Poland and Belarus, or Iraq and Kuwait. In few places in the world will you find such an enormous difference in wealth and political structure, separated merely with a line in the sand. And what even is a border in the first place? We answered a lot of questions in this video so far. We showed how one Nogales became two Nogales, and we explained why one Nogales is in a much worse situation than the other. We detailed the long journey the two countries took to arrive at the place where they are so close, yet
it's
still
been a
so distant.
4-hour-long journey.
But what we didn't talk about so far is why Nogales is not improving to be more like Nogales, and what may be done to change Nogales into being more like Nogales. For many Americans, a priority in their political discourse is to keep Nogales out and away from Nogales, and by that extent the rest of the country. But how do you secure a border? How do you keep a society that resides on the other side of a border out? The first border wall along the Mexican-American border came to be as a result of the Vietnam War. During that war, the Americans used large flat steel plates that could be placed on grass plains to be used as temporary airfields. After the war, there was no more use for them. So Nixon started, and Reagan continued, lining them up along the Mexican border. But those steel plates were not built for this. They started rusting through and were stolen by Mexicans who sold them as scrap metal. Yes, that is not a joke. Border security outside of partisan politics, mudslinging, in geopolitical conversations are more a source of involuntary comedy than anything else. The Croatians, for example, in what they probably thought of as a very smart move, mined their border with Serbia. However, when the border rivers flooded, they washed those mines into Croatian towns and villages. The Arab Gulf states spent billions on a high-tech border fence of razor wire traps and motion sensors along the Saudi-Iraqi border to keep the poor Arabs away from the rich Arabs. However, the rich Arabs seem to have forgotten that they live in a desert with shifting sand dunes that attach to structures and consequently buried the multi-billion dollars worth of fence. So, if you are a viewer wondering what will happen to the recently built segments of wall along the Mexican-American border, well, basically you just need to wait for the price of scrap metal to go up again. It's even built in nice steel rails, easy to just cut down with a blowtorch and transport to any scrap metal dealer south of Nogales. For Mexicans, the border wall is just free shit at the border. But
The Mexicans, we're waiting for the wall to be built so we can steal it and sell it.
why do these ridiculous failures keep happening? Why do states keep making the same border mistakes over and over again? Because we think of borders in wrong terms, namely in military terms. In military terms, the United States has great borders. Invade from the west and you are forced to cross the world's largest ocean. The next best staging and support ground is still a 6-hour flight from the United States. Invade from the east and you will have to cross the second largest ocean in the world, with no staging ground anywhere in that ocean. Invade from the north and you will have to undergo the logistical challenge of crossing the Great Lakes or go through the mid and far west, where the Americans can just do a Russia, retreat, burn the earth, and wait for the winter to freeze you. Invade from the south and you will have to march through miles of deserts with inhabitants known to be hostile to outsiders, only to have to then cross the Rockies, or get stuck in the Midwest and freeze again, or end up in a swamp with inhabitants known to be hostile to outsiders. In military terms, these are great borders that protect the American industrial and infrastructure core, but what makes borders great in a military sense doesn't always make them great in a migration control sense. Britain has crappy military borders, namely with staging grounds for potential invasion being very close. To fight off any potential invader, Britain has therefore always needed to be ahead in numbers and technology in its air force, but especially in its navy. Bully all those who were building a larger navy and dominate the seas. In reverse though, Britain's borders are militarily also great for invasion by the British. As an island staging ground, Britain can conduct military interventions easily across European coastlines and beyond. However, from a non-military point of view, Britain's borders and the borders of all island nations are great in limiting and controlling immigration. Technically, island nations are capable of controlling any and all immigration more than any other country with land borders. The reason we often overlook this is again a distorted view of immigration, namely that it is framed as an invasion. However, there are fundamental differences between an invading army and a migration of people. An invading army needs a logistical backing of fuel, food, munitions, spare parts and other supplies. Building such a long extended supply chain across desert, swamp or flat terrain over several miles long is extraordinarily difficult, while also having to ensure fighting conditions for the invading
go
troops.
ask Russia,
Building it up on a staging place not far from where you intend to invade and only having to cross ocean is, however, not as difficult. Migrants, however, do not need military logistics and planning. Migrants come in small units of families, groups, or individuals.
Can we take a moment to appreciate the art? Country balls are a great way of learning about countries, and look at this. This is really well made. So yeah, I just wanted to take a second.
They require and only have access to the logistics of traveling families, groups, and individuals. What might be a tough challenge to an invading army requires merely the logistics of provisions and sleeping bags for a migrant group. After overcoming that challenge, the migrant also simply melts into society rather than having to enforce their order through occupation upon it. This is why trekking across the Sierra Madre is far easier for a small group of migrants than it would be for an invading army, and why crossing the English Channel is far more difficult for a group of migrants than it would be for an invading army. A wall might be a great means of protecting yourself from a 2nd century warband of Highland Celts, but a wall will not work to keep migrants out. Something the American government learned by the early 2000s, and as the former head of US Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, put it,
"Show me a 50-foot high wall, and I will show you a 51-foot long ladder."
Additionally, a wall along that border
True
is
that.
simply a geographic, legal and financial impossibility. The border is 3,145 kilometers or 2,000 miles long. That's the length of the communist Iron Curtain, excluding the Soviet-Finnish border. Maintenance of the Central European Iron Curtain contributed substantially to bankrupting Eastern Bloc states. And unlike
Wow.
Europe, the US-Mexican border doesn't run through construction-friendly flat grasslands like the Berlin Wall did. It runs through mountains, deserts, and rivers, often miles from any settlements that could function as guard outposts.
It's incredibly
occasionally on
complex.
terrain that a wall can't even be physically built on. The rugged outcrops of the Mexican Plateau and the Sierra Madre de Occidental, and also the marshlands of the Rio Grande, which both Mexico and the United States agreed in 1970 to be environmentally protected lands across the border. Drainage of these marshes...
How bad really is the migration situation? Because, I mean, I obviously don't like the recently acquired aggressivity. Is that a word? Aggressiveness of like new governments in America, particularly past ones. But at the same time, I understand, you can't really just let people in without any restriction. But as far as I'm aware, I don't think a lot of Mexicans really cause problems in the U.S. I can honestly tell that most people just want to work. And I think, you would want that, a population that just wants to work, wants to contribute to your economy and not make any trouble. And I've read, not really studies, but more of articles in the sense that, because of that fear of being deported, actually Mexican Americans commit very low crime. Not Mexican Americans, Mexicans who live in the U.S. Undocumented. They commit less crime out of fear of deportation. I mean, you could even say they are the best drivers because they are so scared of even committing the tiniest of driving infractions, because that would mean you could interact with the police and maybe they could deport you. And I know there's a way to protect the migrants, but everyday migrants, they don't really know that. They don't have that knowledge. So, I think on that regard, it's good. I could understand some of the downsides. I understand also a lot of people feel maybe threatened that their culture is changing or is going to change into some sort of neo-Mexican Texas, for example. But I can tell you it's not like that. I mean, I went to Houston. It doesn't look like Mexico at all, even though like half the people over there are either Mexican or other types of Hispanics. So, you can tell me how you feel about it. If you agree, if you disagree, what's your stand? I'm not going to shame anyone for their politics unless you go like really far. But I understand both sides. I have my own opinions on what I would like to see implemented, but there's not really a necessity to talk about politics here.
And swamps to build a wall would be an unparalleled ecological disaster. In short, if Americans would listen to geographers, there would be no more demands for a border wall, as they would know that the wall is literally a physical impossibility. Alas, few people listen to geographers. The wall is also a financial impossibility, or at the very least a heavy burden. You can't just build a wall and hope the Mexicans won't climb over it. Or more likely, just steal it to sell for scrap metal. No, you will have to guard it. You will have to hire government-employed security details with vehicles and the required training, the required legal backing, and building infrastructure to guard such a vast wall. Not to mention that the estimates of the costs of the wall alone for building it lie at $40 billion.
Oof.
The Bush administration was the first to realize this. It realized that the most efficient means of border security was to instead arrest migrants after they crossed the border and reached the towns they tried to settle in. The logistics of merely seeking out migrants during the process as they try to melt into society is far more cost efficient than most border security measures involving walls and patrols. And since the 2000s, this has consequently been the preferred mechanism of migration control. However, there is also a fundamental problem in itself with the idea of border separation. Borders are almost never clear-cut limits between languages, cultures, and ethnic groups. Compare border maps with language and ethnic maps, and you will almost always see overlap. And this is even more the case here than anywhere else. You can't just draw a line and assume that cultures on both sides will not mingle, trade, and mix. A bottom line is that Hispanic culture is part of the United States. There are Hispanic populations that have been in the United States since the 1500s. Latino culture in particular has been around for a very long time. Mexican migrant populations also vary significantly in culture. Those that arrived between the 1940s and 1960s are mostly Mexican Latinos who themselves settled into and became part of Latino cultures in the United States, while Mexican migrants who arrived throughout the 1990s and 2000s are often Southern Mexicans that settled in urban centers such
like
as Los
LA,
Angeles,
yeah.
New York, and Chicago, and formed a new Hispanic Mexican-American urban culture that is also in itself very different from urban Hispanic Puerto Rican culture in New York or urban Cuban culture in Miami. Politically Mexican-American population
Vete. Sorry about that.
populations also do not form a unified entity anymore. Urban populations tend to vote Democratic, while Latinos tend to vote Republican. But as you have probably realized,
Yeah, have you seen a map of like the 2020 election in like a lot of border regions? It's fairly split, and even some regions go more Republican than Democrat, which I was surprised about that. Like a lot of the border counties in Texas, for example, either went red or were extremely close to go red, which is just an interesting dynamic. Miami, the city of Miami, one of the largest ones in the U.S., was like, what, 6 to 8 points to go to Donald Trump? That's a lot. I mean, that's really a lot. Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, they are getting more integrated in the political system, which it's good or bad. You decide.
Of this video, you can't simply separate American and Mexican culture. The two evolved separately, but still together. As much as some of them may dislike the other or be separated from the
Mitt
other,
Romney's
they
dad was
can't
born in
ignore
Mexico.
the fact that they still are tied together. As said before, they may be distant in some ways, yet they are still so close. The assumption that a clear line of cultural separation exists is simply mistaken. And we so far didn't even mention the fact that a wall would cut right through the lands of the Tohono O'odham, who already made it clear that they would oppose a wall on their sovereign land. In economic terms, the impossibility of this becomes even more obvious when you look at the shared economic zones, one of the main reasons why the idea of a tightly controlled border is so ridiculous. In the state of Texas alone, you will find several car manufacturing plants which Texan politicians will claim are there because Texas is so business friendly. That's true, but it's not because of Texas in particular, but because of the Texas border. The so-called Texas-Mexico Automotive Supercluster region stretches from North Texas to San Luis Potosi and is one of the largest economic cooperative zones in the world. Established in 2008, it includes 27 car manufacturing plants, 230 suppliers, 15 research concerts, 21 airports, 19 ports, 5 railroads, several major international corporations from 7 countries, stretching across 1 American and 4 Mexican states, and in total employs 17 million people. This is one of the most developed and well-functioning economic zones in the world, and it is very one-sided in how it functions. The production of heavy equipment parts, and automotive parts happens almost completely in Mexico, from where these are shipped into Texas for further assembly in automotive, commercial, specialty, and military vehicles. There's a cross-dependence here that goes both ways. There are about 5 million jobs in the United States economy which are dependent on trade with Mexico. The total value of this to the United States lies at $548.7 billion, with Texas, California, Michigan, and Illinois getting the largest share of the pie. But the pie overall being fairly evenly shared amongst states, no matter if they are red states, blue state, contested state, southern state, northern state, Midwest state, or western state. The least dependent state is Hawaii, with only $11 million worth and 24,000 jobs dependent on trade with Mexico. What the United States exports to Mexico is diverse and ranges from Oklahoma chemicals, Washington apples, Mississippi poultry, Wyoming
Hey,
liquid
I actually buy a lot of Washington apples. I buy a lot of American stuff.
Minnesota soy, Virginia pork, Massachusetts computer parts, South Carolina tires, Montana lumber, and Oregon potatoes. The portfolio of what the United States exports to Mexico is 30% machines and machine parts, 8% chemicals, 16% petroleum and raw materials, 10% vehicle and vehicle parts, 8% metals, 9% plastic and polymer materials, 2% agricultural produce, and overall very balanced and evenly spread out across the various sectors of the US economy. In total, US exports to Mexico make up 16% of overall exports. Let's compare this though to Mexico. Mexican exports
like
to the United
50%.
States have a total value of $340 billion, slightly more than half the value of American exports to Mexico, however make up a majority 77%.
Oh, 77,
of
yeah,
Mexico's
way
foreign
more,
exports,
way more.
82% if you add America's hat. The vast majority of those exports are machine parts, worth $136 billion at 40% of exports, and vehicle parts at a value of $95 billion at 28% of exports. The first specialized sector to export in numbers are medical devices that make up only 5% of exports, and Mexican food exports that make up 3.5%, which however make up 60% of Mexico's overall food exports. And of those food exports, 33% are beer, 13% are liquor, 11%
Wow.
are baked goods, 6% are sugar, and 8% are sodas and fruit juices, while Mexico itself imports vegetables from the United States, meaning Mexican migrant farm laborers literally illegally cross the border to earn money by working on vegetable farms to then, upon returning to Mexico, spend that money buying the very products that they earned their wages harvesting.
Yes.
It is hard to pin
Yes,
down
sir.
how many Mexican jobs are dependent on Mexican
Oh, it's a
exports
lot.
to the United States, but the number must be in the tens of millions. A table comparing percentage changes in professionally educated Mexican workers between 1992 and 2010 will show you that although education levels have grown amongst professionals, they have not grown substantially, and mostly only between 4% to 15%. This means that despite the opening of trade between the two, the main benefactor is still the United States. But one of the most crucial numbers in all of this is 350 million. That is the number of legal border crossings. Yes, legal, with work or tourist visas, the single most cross-border in human history, which goes to underline
Wow.
more that the means
Yeah.
of regulating and limiting the flow of people, money and goods is extremely limited. These are market forces that in total have a value of up to $1 trillion. As one particular market shows, it is often completely impossible to rein in on the simple laws of supply and demand. Many measures of limitation often end up being counterproductive. Guarding the border more heavily ironically had the effect of there being more illegal residents within the United States. That is because in particular farm and construction laborers frequently overstay their work visa. This is merely an inherent part of the work process itself. Farming seasons as well as construction plans can often extend over periods of time that are longer than expected or anticipated. A construction boss or farmer may ask laborers to stay on for additional weeks or even months, who consequently overstay their visas. This means, however, that from then on they reside in the United States illegally, which makes returning to Mexico harder as they can no longer cross the border back without being registered or arrested as an illegal, and thereby cancelling out the prospect of a future legal return. Consequently, when the border is strictly guarded, migrant laborers inside the United States often simply choose to stay to earn more than risk being legally barred from returning.
Yeah, I think a lot of people really should understand. Believe it or not, a lot of Mexicans like Mexico and they like their culture and their music and their families. And a lot of workers would probably return if they had that chance. Like they would work in the USA for periods of time, or if they live real close to the border, like travel every day. I mean, people who live in San Diego, y'all know. There's a lot of people from Tijuana and the whole Tijuana metro area that work in San Diego, right? And then they come back that night to Mexico and they sleep and they have dinner there. They, take their children to school in Mexico and they just simply go to work in San Diego. That's how it is, and that's how a lot of people would do it in Mexico. So yeah, I think when you protect the border, when you have that harsh immigration laws, ironically, people just stay because they have to work. You gotta eat. Your family has to eat. So you're gonna do everything possible, risking your own life to feed your family. A wall is not gonna stop someone risking their life to feed their families. That's not gonna stop. But a wall is gonna stop people from returning to Mexico. Maybe people just want to work some years, accumulate a little bit of wealth, and then return to Mexico and better their communities. I think it'd be better if there were laws that adapted to that. A lot of the wealth, first of all, a lot of the Mexicans wouldn't stay in the U.S., which for some weird reason, a lot of people would feel happy about that. And the Mexicans would produce, right? They would work, have labor in the U.S., pay their taxes for whatever time they stay there, contribute to the U.S. economy because they are living there and they are buying food to eat in the U.S., and that contributes to the economy. And they would return and make their communities better and maybe invest a little bit in Mexican communities. And maybe that whole investment would make people not move to the U.S. because they have opportunities now in their home country. It's just a very weird system, and I don't want to blame this on the Americans because it's just a two countries fault. And you just saw an entire hour of Kraut explaining the Mexican political system. And I think y'all now have a really good grasp of how fucked up Mexico is, just in a summarized sense.
Immigration measures have created weird social phenomena within the United States, such as a decline in armed robberies of liquor stores. Now you may ask how that is connected to Mexican migrant labor. Well, it has to do with financial regulations and something called dark numbers. Someone designated as an illegal cannot open a bank account in the United States or by any other means transfer money back to Mexico. A result of this is that migrant laborers, especially those without visas, often hold on to their earnings in cash. A migrant laborer can hold up to $10,000 of cash on himself after half a year's work in the United States. And at some point, criminals in the United States noticed that if they rob a migrant, they can get more money than by robbing a liquor store at less risk. The migrant doesn't have the legal means to defend himself,
and
the migrant cannot call the police, since he would risk getting deported. This resulted in something called a dark number. A dark number is when the actual number in a statistic is expected to be larger than officially declared. A well-known example of a dark number is domestic violence, where official numbers are always higher than actual incidents, because many incidents are not reported. In the specific case of robberies committed against migrant laborers, it is possible for this to happen because of what is called a legal vacuum. Such an environment is not the war which Hobbes wrote about in Leviathan. It is when, within a functioning state with a legal system, through political neglect and legal uncertainty, spaces and environments are created in which laws do not apply or cannot be enforced. A labor migrant designated an illegal by law falls into such a legal vacuum by being unable to access any legal protections or rights. The law creates communities which by their very existence are outside of the law. And as awful as all of this sounds, this is a sustainable and not an unsustainable status quo. You will never see business owners who hire Mexican migrant labor face legal consequences for doing so. The state of Texas may have a lot of politicians who deal in loud anti-immigration and anti-migrant labor rhetoric, but those same politicians will then openly promote the state itself as a location to business owners with brochures that detail the economic structure built on the vicinity and access to cheap labor. In sociocultural and political terms, the wall is more of a symbol of the vicious partisan political divisions within the United States than what separates America from Mexico. There's no agreement within the United States on how to confront an existing problem. There only is an agreement upon the fact that there is a problem. The United States, the largest accumulation of wealth in human history, borders an impoverished country with a semi-failed state. And throughout the last century, this has created a status quo in which cheap labor and basic materials cross the border in exchange for consumer goods. In a way, the truth of the matter is that this status quo has in many ways, shapes and forms existed since the Spanish Empire. Mexican economic institutions were built around the enriching of a small elite through shipping its resources abroad and neglecting domestic development, as well as limiting the political freedoms of the Mexican public. And in whatever direction the sometimes vicious partisan political debate within the US may be going, be it for a closed border with strict immigration laws or a more open border with easy routes to citizenship, neither ever challenged the root cause of the problem. the remnants and legacy of failed political and economic institutions in Mexico itself. The troubling truth is that the United States policies proposed towards Mexico by both parties have been policies that would further a continuation of the status quo. A stricter closed-border immigration approach will very simply not stop the market forces created by the disparity of wealth. Mexicans will keep coming as long as they are poor, and as long as they see no future in Mexico, and as long as their state remains dysfunctional. No wall will change that. And without changing the cause of the wealth disparity between Mexico and the United States, an open border immigration policy would continuously siphon Mexico's most valuable resource out of it, namely its people, without changing why Mexicans leave Mexico in the first place. Basically, turning the United States into a parasitic entity profiteering out of Mexico's misery.
Whoa.
Let's go to another continent for an example of how borders can be managed differently. The southern half of the border between Sweden and Finland is shaped by the river Torn. At its southernmost tip, where the river flows into the Baltic, lie the Finnish city of Tornio and the Swedish city of Haparanda. Haparanda was just a fishing village 200 years ago, and right across the river in Finland was Tornio, which already was a city at that time. Sweden, which at the time ruled Finland, decided to join the Napoleonic Wars against Russia and lost. As a consequence, they had to give up Finland to Russia, and with it, the city of Tornio. Sweden, however, wanted a major city at the turn into the Baltic, so it consequently decided to build Haparanda into a city. Today, these two are twin cities, separated just by a river that happens to be a border. Like all borders, there's cultural overlap. In Finland, northern Finland is populated by a Swedish minority, and many regions are bilingual. In Sweden, the north has a Finnish minority, and regions are bilingual. The administrations of Tornio and Haparanda are aware of this, and therefore decided to engage in a unique cooperative governance. Both cities are in official languages of administration, culture and commerce, bilingual in Finnish
Scandinavia,
and Swedish,
always doing
but
things
also
right.
to share costs in infrastructure and services such as public baths, sewage system management, schools, water management, waste disposal, recycling, police, ambulance and fire emergency services, and a common tourism information and guide board. The cities even share two common logos and names, Tornio Haparanda and Haparanda Tornio. This cooperation and sharing in services saves both cities a lot of work and money to be invested
it's freaking
elsewhere.
cold, dude.
So how come that Nogales doesn't work with Nogales? Why is there no Nogales? Technically speaking, this is done within the United States itself, with Minneapolis and St. Paul across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Along the American border with Canada, you will find numerous examples of cross-border cooperation, mainly done by towns irrespective of their state and federal government. In particular along the border between Alaska and British Columbia, where some Alaskan towns are so isolated they depend on cooperation with their Canadian neighbors for commerce or even just basic supplies and schools. But as you probably guessed, Canada is also not a failed state or poor, and to a degree this type of cooperation already happens in Mexico, just very one-sided. The destitute state of the Mexican schooling system results in many Mexican border communities signing their children up for high schools in the United States. Many in border communities seek out employment across the border. This is cooperation, however, on an unofficial level, because on an official level, the simple fact remains that local Mexican governments and authorities remain too corrupt and incompetent to facilitate any such thing. Additionally, Mexico, the United States and Canada have so far been unable to negotiate and agree on a common immigration and visa agreement. You may or may not know, for example, that the Republican Party has frequently stated that any such agreement would require all countries to adopt Mexican immigration laws as a common standard. That may confuse you as to why Republicans would want Mexican immigration laws. And well, it's because Mexico has the strictest immigration law.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Mexico has really, really tough immigration systems. Why? I'm not entirely sure, because honestly there's not lines of people waiting to come into Mexico. It's just that, as far as I understand it, and maybe Kraut will tell us why, just Mexico always supported like European immigration and nothing else. If you weren't European, you really couldn't immigrate to Mexico, and in a weird way that sort of remains since nobody bothered to change the system at all. So when you look at the largest immigrant groups in Mexico, it's just small, very small communities of Spaniards, Germans, Italians, French, and of course the very large American retiree community. even within Mexico, there's not a whole lot Latinos from other countries, let alone people from Africa, from India, from China, from the Middle East. There are people with a lot of ancestry from these places, but there's not immigrant communities from these places. So yeah, it's not common to find an immigrant in Mexico. Really, we have one of the lowest. Our immigration percentage, it's even lower than Japan. I mean, it's like less than 1%. So let's see what's going on.
Being in Mexico illegally can be punished with up to 10 years in prison. And even more astounding, Mexican immigration law states that it is the duty of the state to protect the demographic balance of the nation. Yes, this means that you could technically be deported from Mexico for being black.
Yeah, no shit.
Attempts
This is
to
true.
find agreements in cooperation between the three countries have so far simply not borne any fruit. The irony of this, however, is that if these three could cooperate in matters of border security, the common border would be much easier to protect, namely the Mexican border with Guatemala, which is only 500 miles long, more compact, and runs through terrain that is more easily guarded. And this is where we reach a weird point, because despite there not being a structured official agreement on cooperation in laws, services, and infrastructure, measures towards such happen anyway. The Americans are aware that most migrants coming to the United States increasingly come from Central America and increasingly pay the Mexicans to guard their southern border more strictly. There's also another social and economic development that is overlooked. When the Mexican-American border is presented, it is often presented from the American perspective on the American side, and predominantly what is shown are the demographic changes along the border within the US. There's even conspiracy talk about how Mexicans are supposedly gradually taking over the southern United States to turn it into Mexico and reclaim it. But this is very misleading. American borderlands from Texas to California are firmly integrated within the US states and the wider United States. They are a firm part of the US legal, economic, cultural, political, and social framework. You get a far better insight when you look at the US-Mexican border on the Mexican side. In particular, when you look at the maps of roads and highways. For decades, Mexican governments neglected northern Mexico, resulting in highways and other infrastructure being subpar, or at the very least, badly connected to the center
Mexico
of administration
City
within
centric.
Mexico City. Mexico's economy of scale doesn't fully reach over northern Mexico. However, when you look closer, you will notice that the existing highways and roads of northern Mexico are better tied into the United States highway system than they are into Mexico. Because despite the lack of agreements and cooperation, the economic forces at play are gradually developing northern Mexico into an American sphere of influence. Nogales is better tied into Tucson than it is into Mexico City. Baja California is better integrated into California than into the rest of Mexico. And for all intents and purposes, Austin, Texas may as well be the capital of northern Mexico. The often repeated conspiracy of a Mexican takeover of
It's
the
actually
southern
the
United
other
States
way
is not
around.
only untrue, the opposite is the case. Northern Mexico, disconnected from the Mexican centers of authority and administration, left to itself, is increasingly becoming more American. As Mexico disintegrates, America integrates what Mexico increasingly loses control over, not through government action, but through commerce and culture.
Through
There's not
capitalism.
much tying northern Mexico into southern Mexico. Culturally, they now have more in common with the Mexican Americans north of the border.
Oh,
the
yeah,
American state
totally.
also provides
I mean, even for things like food, I remember when I spent a few months in Baja and Tijuana and all that region. I mean, people there eat burritos. Now, you might, as an American, think, well, duh, burritos are a Mexican food, but that's not true. Here, living in Mexico City, I've yet to see a place that solely sells burritos as like a food. And if you get to find burritos in a place, it's generally like either Tex-Mex or just strictly American restaurants. But if you go to northern Mexico, these are found everywhere. And it's the same with American-style foods and even a little bit of American-style architecture. The U.S. currency is used in a lot of these towns and a lot of these border regions. And I could really go on. This region is very well integrated into the U.S. Very well. Very, very, very much so. And if you ever come to visit the northern regions of Mexico, you'll see that too. You can go to Mexico City and then go to northern Mexico, and you'll see that, other than the language, they don't really have a lot in common.
larger market and more services than southern Mexico. And due to the continuing integration into the American economy, northern Mexico is now 3 times wealthier than the Mexican average.
Oh, yeah.
If the Mexican
true.
government were to introduce protective legislation against increasing American economic influence, it would face considerable backlash from northern Mexico. As the economist Juan Enriquez pointed out, the northern states of Mexico would much rather prefer a European Union-style relationship with the United States than being deeper tied into Mexico City. And other historians have pointed out that it is far more likely for the Mexican states of Baja California, Nuevo León, Coahuila, Chihuahua, and Sonora to break away and form their own independent country should the Mexican state further disintegrate, or to even join the United States. As much as it may seem from an American perspective that American border states are becoming more Mexican, the often overlooked but very obvious reality is that America is the more powerful and influential entity, and that the exact opposite is in fact happening. Northern Mexico is becoming more American. A large part in this process is done by something called trans-re-immigration. This is when immigrant communities retain a strong connection to their place of origin and consequently import social, cultural, and political structures from the country they emigrated to back to the country of origin. An example is how Portuguese migrant laborers to France from the 1950s to 1970s took part and learned from French labor unions how to politically organize and participate within the political structures of the French Republic. These Portuguese migrant laborers kept ties into or even returned to their Portuguese homeland, where they used what they had learned in France to help them overthrow the fascist Salazar regime and establish a modern Portuguese republic. Similarly, many Mexican immigrants and migrant laborers import cultural and economic structures from the United States
Very
back
important,
into Mexico.
yes.
Although many draw parallels between how Texas became part of the United States through American migration to Texas and conclude that Mexican immigration is leading to a slow reverse reconquista of sorts, the reality is in fact the opposite. Remember how Texas gradually became part of the United States. Just how during the 1840s Mexican Texas was economically and through infrastructure better integrated into the United States than into the rest of Mexico, Sonora, Baja California, and Coahuila are today better integrated in infrastructure into the United States than into the rest of Mexico. You may chuckle at, or not even be aware of, the occasional article written by Mexican journalists arguing to have places like Baja California become part of American California and form a massive superstate dominating the Pacific coastline. But the truth is, as ridiculous as it may sound, the more destabilized the Mexican state becomes, the less it can manage to integrate its regions into a Mexican economy of scale, and the more American influence integrates northern Mexico into the United States. And so, the more likely it actually becomes.
Wow. Oh, snap. That'd be definitely an interesting...
When Americans discuss
news.
the issue of the southern border, they do so very one-sidedly. They never take a moment to look at Mexico itself and ask why this is an issue in the first place. You can turn on Fox News and hear someone ramble about the supposedly impending mestizo apocalypse, or MSNBC about how the border should be completely open. Bottom line remains that all solutions proposed in the American political circus are still quite insufficient. Neither challenge the status quo, but only suggest solutions that prolong and in either financial or electoral ways profit from the status quo. The status quo being a fundamentally broken socio-political system and an economic dependency. Americans in their culture war-dominated politics very rarely have serious discussions on how to resolve the issues that cause their border problems in the first place. Many Americans don't even know how significant the year 2000 was for Mexico, when the PRI state collapsed, and that the current violence and disorder is the result of a collapsed state structure.
Yeah,
that Mexico...
You can watch Narcos Mexico in Netflix. It's also on Netflix. And they explain a lot of this transition, and you understand. Either Narcos Mexico or the one that I talked about before, the El Chapo series.
Itself has, for the past 20 years,
It's like
it's
like a soap
process
opera.
of asking itself where it should go now, what solutions it should try to take to improve the lives of Mexicans. That multi-party democracy is something new to Mexico, barely a generation old. Mexican democracy is only 20 years old and should be protected as much as possible. Since 2000, Mexicans for the first time have the ability to determine the path their country takes themselves, rather than having it dictated to them by an unelected authoritarian elite. So, what would resolve the issue at hand? For the root cause of the problem to be addressed, the open and democratic political institutions in Mexico, being gradually built after the year 2000, must be strengthened, public accountability and an independent judiciary being chief amongst them. The ability for Mexicans to openly and impactfully take part in the political process, and laws that apply equally to all. The old ways of doing things, in which elitist cliques form to enrich themselves while holding the rest of the country down, must be removed in their entirety. The Mexican state must provide the freedom for its citizens to participate in the economy on their own terms within a level playing field, without obstruction, and to make their innovations and labor count for themselves. Furthering a Mexican economy that can provide for Mexicans would mean supporting Mexican business and entrepreneurship by Mexicans in Mexico. The state must be made to provide law and order and security for all. The war on drugs must come to an end for the stranglehold the cartels hold on large parts of the country to be finally broken. And addressing these issues is more urgent than you may think at first. If the trends in Chinese wages are going to continue as they do right now, then Mexican labor might soon be cheaper than Chinese labor. All those factories making phones and other consumer goods for American markets might soon be cheaper to operate in Mexico. Within a decade, in fact, by 2030, your phone might be made in Mexico. And when that happens, it will be important to know who this benefits. Will it help create a stable Mexican middle class, as Mexican entrepreneurs will run these factories and Mexican laborers will have the guaranteed security to work, live, and prosper from their own labor? Or will such an industry be run by a kleptocratic oligarchy again, resulting in the socio-economic structures of colonial Spain, which adapted into an independent oligarchy, then adapted into an industrialized dictatorship, then adapted into a socialist republic, and then adapted into a neoliberal market economy, to then adapt again, to continue into the 21st century? Ultimately, the answer to this will have to come from Mexicans themselves. But for Americans, it might be time to adjust their political culture to stop framing Mexico as either an immigration threat or immigration benefit, and to start debating what kind of neighbors they want to be and what role they want to play in the continuing democratization of Mexico. At the end of my videos, I usually announce what the next video will be about, but things are a little different this time, because it takes me 2 to 3 months to make these long 1 hour to 2 hour long videos. YouTube seems to be punishing me in the algorithm by listing my channel as inactive and even unsubscribing people without their knowledge. I am therefore going to make shorter 10 to 30 minute long videos for the rest of this year that will be uploaded on a monthly basis, and in March 2022 I will then work on a big 4-hour long series again. Now, if you need another long format series of videos, there's a friend of mine who can help you out.
And hello there, this is Nomad Star. You might know me from my contributions to Kraut's videos throughout this last year. Well, I have been inspired by this work style we have, and I decided
Alright, well, I think that is it. Wow, oh my god, guys. Oh my god. That was a religious experience for me. That was so insane, so crazy. I really, really enjoyed it so much. Never have I seen a YouTuber or even companies, books, video documentaries, anything that went into detail on the Mexican American culture, Mexican history, American history. How are they linked together? How are they different? Why did the US grow different than Mexico? Why did Mexico grow different than the US? I mean, it's insane the amount of detail that this video documentary has, and I can't imagine how much Kraut had to read about Mexico and maybe even about the US to create this docuseries. I mean, I'm blown away, and I admire him for that, and I really wish to read a lot of the books that he read and inform myself. I want to learn more about the American culture, but also more about my own culture, because I learned a lot about Mexico, a lot of things that I didn't knew, or a lot of things that I did knew, like the Mexican Revolution, but this video gave me a lot more insight. I think it's important that because we're neighbors and because we're a nation that interact a whole lot, maybe even more than we might think at first time. Here in Mexico, we don't hear a lot about the U.S. Maybe in the U.S., you don't hear a lot about Mexico and about what's going on. But I think every year, every 5 years, every decade, our countries are a little bit more integrated. My personal prediction is, hey, one day we're going to be either a single block of countries or some sort of, at the very least, monetary union between our three countries, because Canada too. We are seeing that the U.S. is retrieving from the Middle East. I think America's policy for the future is going to be non-interventionist. We saw both Trump or Biden weren't really pro-war or America should be everywhere. And I think this trend is going to continue, both for Republicans and Democrats. And the trend of America invading other places and having military bases everywhere might remain, but America as a political entity is going to retrieve to its own neighborhood, the Americas, and North America to be more specifically. And I just wish that Mexico adopted a lot more of all the great qualities that make America great, because America, it's truly a great place with a lot of problems for sure, like every country in the world, but it's truly a nation to admire, and us as a southern neighbor definitely have probably the best example to learn from. And I would also like to see, a little bit more acknowledgement of Hispanic culture and its contributions to America. I think that's happening already. And yeah, I just wish further integration, at least economically for now, but as Mexico develops, maybe other forms of integration. I speak English very well, and I'm completely fluent in Spanish, obviously. And I consume American and Mexican culture apart. And I could be the plain example that a combination of cultures is achievable. And I don't know. This was really good. I hope that you liked it as much as I did, because I really enjoyed it. To all the people who have watched the videos, I really appreciate your comments, consuming my content. I'm going to take a while to edit this, but I'll try to make very few edits so I can upload it maybe even today. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. If you appreciate my content, you can give it a like, you can subscribe, you can comment a suggestion of what other videos I could react. I'm going to keep modifying my office. I want to add some RGB lights. I want to fix some of the foam. And yeah, that's all for me. So take care, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.